Welcome to Group Three's presentation.
Our case analysis is based upon a case that occurred here in Colorado during the COVID pandemic. The plaintiffs in this case are Dr. Jane Doe, who is a practicing Roman Catholic, and John Doe, who is a first-year medical student who is a practicing Buddhist. The defendants in this case are the University of Colorado, specifically the Chancellor of Anschutz Medical Campus and the Senior Associate Dean. The lawsuit challenges the university's COVID-19 vaccine mandate and its process for granting religious exemptions. The plaintiffs in this case state that the University of Colorado violated their constitutional rights due to their COVID-19 vaccine policy. They state their First Amendment right was violated due to the discriminatory process that granted some religious exemptions while rejecting others. They also state that this policy would violate their 14th Amendment by infringing upon their fundamental rights to medical autonomy. The plaintiffs state that the enforcement of this policy would lead to the immediate termination of Dr. Jane Doe and a possible leave of absence or expulsion for the student John Doe. The defendants in this case state the policy was created in the interest of public safety. They also state that they question whether the religious beliefs were truly held or if these religious exemptions were more of a personal or political choice, specifically noting that they had a history of receiving other vaccinations.
So with this case, there was one main question that needed to be answered, and that was, can the university deny the religious exemptions of students based on their interpretation of the different denominations' teachings and rather than the beliefs held by those students? As pointed out, there are two main possible constitutional rights violations that the plaintiffs would need to prove were violated. The first one being the First Amendment and the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause states that anyone can practice religion and that the government is not allowed to interfere with them. There has already been cases brought forward and rulings made on the Free Exercise Clause. One of those being Employment Division v. Smith, a case brought forward in 1990. This case determined that if a policy was not neutral and generally applicable, that strict scrutiny would be applied. That is when the government must prove that the policy was implemented to achieve a compelling interest by the least restrictive means. In the case of the university and their mandate, it was not done in the least restrictive way, since it was only applicable to certain denominations, meaning it was not neutral and left rational basis for the court to consider.
The plaintiffs claimed the university policy violated their 14th Amendment rights under the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause states that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. The court's filings had language suggesting exemptions were being granted only for religious beliefs that were opposed to all immunizations. This type of language became the main issue. Plaintiffs argued that religious exemptions were sorted into approved and disapproved categories, favoring religions that had a formal anti-vaccine doctrine and giving preference to those exemption requests over the requests based on individual religious belief or understanding. The plaintiffs needed to prove that the policy clearly favored some religions over others. Also, the medical exemptions were granted more easily than religious ones. Exemptions should be granted equally. The plaintiff's fundamental right of medical autonomy, meaning they could not make their own personal decision about their health, was in question. The plaintiffs felt that the policy was not neutral or generally applicable because medical exemptions were only allowed for some religions, many being denied based on the denomination claimed. Also, the administration of the university was evaluating religious doctrine as well as personal religious conviction of the individuals when they applied for the exemption. There were other rulings about discriminating based on specific denomination, an example of which is Larson versus Valente, where the courts ruled that the government cannot show a preference of one religion over another. In this case, the court found that it could not apply strict scrutiny because on the face of the policy, there was not clear favoritism of one religion over another, and the university did not purposefully discriminate against a specific religion or religions. Students and faculty were all expected to comply, and there were exemptions being made. It was not an all or nothing policy. Since strict scrutiny did not apply, the court had to use a rational basis review. The university was interested in public health and safety in a medical campus setting, and this is a strong argument, but the plaintiffs argue that the policy could have addressed safety without the burden of religious exercise. There was an ethical component to this case. In keeping with utilitarian ethical theory, the university was trying to do the greater good for the most people by requiring the vaccine. It can be rationalized that the university was trying to do the best they could to protect public health. The pandemic was a difficult time for our society, and most people wanted to do everything they could to get through the pandemic and overcome the restrictions being placed on lives. The courts seemed to favor that as well. It can be argued that the plaintiffs felt the policy violated their Rawlsian ethical theory. The rules in the policy were not designed for all and were possibly unfair to those with religious beliefs that getting the vaccine would go against the teaching of their religion. It was not fair in their view that the medical and non-secular exemptions were granted, yet their own religious exemptions were not granted.
The University of Colorado's COVID-19 vaccine policy became effective on September 1st, 2021. This policy required all students and employees at the Anschutz Medical Campus to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. The purpose of this policy was to safeguard employees, students, and patients during the public health crisis. This policy did offer two exemption criteria, one which was medical and the second which was religious. Due to a high volume of requested religious exemptions, the university decided to update this policy on September 24, 2021, to clarify the intent and application of the religious exemption process.
Now that we've walked through the constitutional arguments on both sides, let's talk about how this case was actually resolved and what the university could have done differently. The United States District Court of Colorado sided with the plaintiffs and granted a temporary restraining order which blocked the university from enforcing the vaccine mandate while the case moved forward. This was significant because the court did not just say that the outcome was unfair, but it found that the plaintiffs had a likelihood of success on the merits of the case. In other words, the court examined the university's exemption process and said this likely violates the Constitution. The court pointed to Employment Division versus Smith, which demonstrated the university's religious exemption policy was neither neutral nor generally applicable because it limited the exemptions to people whose religions opposed all immunizations. The university pre-screened which beliefs were worthy of protection, and that is not how religious freedoms work according to the Constitution. There are two things that the university should have done differently. First, they should have used an individualized, sincerity-based approach. The standard for religious accommodations is not about whether your religion officially opposes vaccines, but it is about whether you sincerely hold religious beliefs that conflicts with that requirement. Second, the university should have offered less restrictive alternatives instead of jumping to termination or expulsion. They could have made other reasonable accommodations like masking or regular COVID testing or even remote working arrangements. This would have addressed the public health concern without violating individual rights. So, what does this case mean beyond just these two plaintiffs? There are three lessons here that are worth taking with us. The first lesson is about constitutional limits on institutional policy. Public universities are not private employers, they are government entities, and because of this, they are bound by the Constitution in a way that a private employer is not. When a policy is designed by that government entity, it cannot pick favorites when it comes to religion. The exemption process has to be neutral and applied the same way for everyone. The second lesson is sincerity over doctrine. The law has never required someone's individual beliefs to be officially endorsed by a religious institution. The thing that matters is whether or not that individual sincerely holds a belief that conflicts with what they're being asked to do. Government entities cannot place themselves as judges of what religious beliefs are valid. The last lesson is balancing public safety and civil liberties is extremely hard, but it is necessary. Protecting patients on a university medical campus is a serious concern, but the Constitution does not give a pass for good intentions. Even the most compelling government interests have to be pursued in a way that is minimally restrictive as possible. This case shows that how you implement a policy matters just as much as why. Ultimately, this case is much more than just a case about vaccines. It is about whether an institution can define the boundaries of an individual's faith, and the final answer was clear: you cannot. Thank you.